A warning. This episode contains discussion of sexual assault that may be disturbing. Listener discretion is advised. As a note, we reached out to Tim Ballard's attorney to request an interview. Our request went unanswered. And one last thing. After Tim Ballard left the anti-trafficking organization O.U.R in 2023, it was renamed O.U.R Rescue. Its new leaders say they do not condone Tim Ballard's alleged actions while part of the old organization. Last week, we wrapped up episode 9 with a conversation about the smokescreen Tim Ballard hid behind to carry out all of his alleged misconduct. And I say alleged, but at this point, it's pretty obvious what my opinion is. But that brings us to today's episode. We'll be continuing the broader conversation around the climate and context of Ballard's actions. I've got my team here with me today, some of whom you've already met: executive producer Connor Powell, producer Abby Newhouse, and Andrew Iden and Sarah Batchelor. This is The Opportunist. I want to reflect on everything we've learned and to make space for any lingering thoughts from the team. But I want to open with the topic we discussed briefly in episode 9, and that's O.U.R's new leadership, their move to Minnesota, and why they decided not to speak with us. Connor and Andrew, you were able to speak with a member of their PR team. Can you tell us about that conversation?
I'll go ahead and start with this. I had a lot of conversations with people from O.U.R, including Tammy Lee, the new CEO, and one of their lawyers at the very early stages of this series. That conversation was off the record. I'm not going to dive into that conversation a whole lot because, I think we had a really frank conversation, but it ended that first conversation with a discussion and an openness to saying, okay, let's move forward with trying to schedule an interview between us and Tammy to talk about O.U.R in the future.
She sounded pretty open to that, like there wasn't any hesitation.
Yeah, and Tammy has a background in media. She's been a former CEO. I think she's very media savvy in that sense, and so she was open to a conversation. And I think they have a message they want to get out. What they've told us, they sort of disavow the Tim Ballard era. They think they have an important mission, and they're trying to make changes so that the new O.U.R Rescue is in position to help combat child trafficking. And that's the message they wanted to get out, which is perfectly fine. I think that's a legitimate conversation. And that leads us to the conversation we had with their PR team, in which Andrew and I spoke to them and basically tried to, get some questions and some answers about what the conversation might look like. And I left that conversation with the PR team pretty positive. What about you, Andrew?
Yeah, sometimes these conversations are important to have before you get to the interview stage, right? You have to kind of foam the runway, talk a little bit about kind of everyone's intentions. They have a responsibility to talk about O.U.R and kind of the way things are going to be moving forward. Obviously, it's their decision whether what they want to do that. It's also kind of a tough needle to thread because they know going in, they're going to get a lot of questions about the past. They're going to get a lot of questions about Tim Ballard. They obviously felt not talking about it with us was the best way to go. I think we would all kind of disagree on that front, but it's a difficult needle to thread for sure.
I was just looking back at some of my emails, and one of the things that Tammy said in one of my emails was, the move to Minnesota is a definitive break from the past, meaning Tim Ballard, and a fresh start for their future, which, I get that. These are all different people. She wasn't part of the Tim Ballard era. The board wasn't part of the Tim Ballard era. Almost all of the employees that were part of the Tim Ballard era are gone. So they want to continue doing the so-called good work of O.U.R Rescue and sort of break from the Tim Ballard era. And they even said, they told us, we don't condone this. We're not doing the couple's ruse anymore. They want to basically focus on the future. And Andrew and I said that was perfectly fine. We are going to have to ask some questions about the past, though. And I think the question that most bothered them that we said we wanted to ask was, is there a joint defense fund? Is there joint defense resources for Tim Ballard and O.U.R going forward? Meaning, Is any of the money that is going to O.U.R today helping pay for Tim Ballard's defense? And that was the one question where they wouldn't answer. And that was sort of the last question. And that was sort of where the conversation felt like it took a real turn, right, Andrew?
Yeah, I think it was a positive dialogue up until that point, and I think obviously, you know, the answer to that question can have a big bearing on their ability to fundraise moving forward. So you can imagine that if there is some involvement in funding Tim Ballard's legal defense, that's problematic. You mentioned that the O.U.R organization at this point, there's nobody there still that is sort of still left over from the old regime. On some level, that should make sort of their conversation and their dialogue with the media a lot easier, because it's simple. Look, there's nobody here that was involved in that before. We're all trying to move forward. We can address some stuff in the past. They know that's coming. And you're right. That was when the tone shifted.
One of the things that we talked about was because all of the people today at O.U.R Rescue were not there under Tim Ballard. It was going to be a really easy conversation for them. I remember we had this conversation was that basically like, they're going to be able to say like, we don't condone his actions, we condemn it, and we're about the future. And that's literally all we thought they were going to say.
And I would think you would want to take that opportunity to address people who have donated or would possibly donate and clear the air.
Right. And we don't know if any money is going. I mean, they didn't answer the question. It was the only answer they didn't give. And I don't know if there's any shared money or shared resources. It makes logical sense. I talked to a lawyer a couple days ago, and they said a lot of times when there's criminal investigations or lawsuits and that type of things, if an organization has cut ties with a former leader, they almost are bound to have a joint defense relationship because the one organization was connected in the past, and that's what the lawsuits or criminal investigations are about. So it would make sense, but I do think it's in fairness to O.U.R Rescue, the new organization. We don't know if they are sharing any joint resources. It's just they wouldn't answer that question.
Yeah, it's just really messy, and I keep thinking of this quote from Celeste Boris, who we featured in episode 1, where she's talking about the new O.U.R, and she's saying, basically the fact of the matter is you're new and you've changed up everything, but you're still not coming forward to say that the women were done wrong by the old organization.
Abby, let's play that clip from Celeste.
She keeps claiming that they're a new O.U.R and they don't do the operations like they used to do. But the fact of the matter is this: you're a new O.U.R for whatever you've changed up, but you are literally shaming all these women that your old O.U.R has trafficked and abused and shamed and manipulated because you have admitted that you've ousted Tim Ballard. So you know it, and you still are shaming us. And, they're literally suing me.
And that seems to me a very easy thing to admit, and something that they could even stand on to say that we're doing things completely differently going forward. But the fact that they're kind of not, and then in her own words, they're literally suing her. I'm not exactly sure what that means or how that's evolved since our interview, but it kind of feels like they're not taking that opportunity to sever themselves in a real way from Tim Ballard, even though they say they are.
I mean, that kind of goes into the complete lack of responsibility, right?
Yeah, for sure.
Feels like there is sort of a lack of responsibility by a lot of people. And again, I don't think it's necessarily up to Tammy, the new CEO, and everyone to take responsibility for whatever Tim did. But we certainly know Tim's not taking responsibility for his actions. If anything, he's pushing back and is still fighting and basically saying, everything I did was proper. And if you disagree with me, you're on the side of the traffickers and, you hate children, right? I mean, that's basically his attitude. But it does still feel like there should be a lot more investigation into the way the operation ran under Ballard, and a lot more information needs to come out about what was done and what wasn't done. And that's not happening.
I want to give them the benefit of the doubt. Like you said, if they're tied legally right now, then is there really anything they could do for the women that have come in with these suits? I mean, isn't that sort of, they need to leave that alone until that's resolved?
That's kind of what I've been wondering. It seems like a logical explanation.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think the court cases, lawsuits dictate a lot of this, and I think we all understand that, right? Like, I'm not surprised that necessarily they didn't want to do an interview. I think we always thought that an interview was a long shot, although as we were talking to them, they seemed very eager to get their message out, and I think we thought an interview would be possible. You know, in theory, there are no criminal investigations into O.U.R. You know, they sort of have been cleared by all accounts. We know there's criminal investigations into Tim Ballard. Like, we've heard that there are multiple open cases in California and Utah and a couple other places where the women have filed complaints against Tim Ballard for sexual assault. And we don't know what's going on with those. We also know there's the federal lawsuit against Tim Ballard, which I think there's meant to be a hearing here in the next couple of weeks, according to Suzette Rasmussen and the lawyers for the women. So, you know, probably criminal is sort of off the table for O.U.R, but it's certainly not off the table for Tim Ballard.
I was just going to point out O.U.R and Tammy Lee have done interviews. So they have spoken and, had dialogue with outlets about some of these things we're talking about. And those places have asked some of the same questions we have. So what was behind their choice not to do it with us? Hard to say.
And going back to what Connor was saying earlier about O.U.R not having investigations and them being off the table, it brings me back to another quote from Celeste Boris, where she's talking about when she worked at O.U.R.
Abby, we have this soundbite. Let's play it right now.
I'm so angry because I worked at O.U.R for so long before Tim got a hold of me. And like, they were my friends, right? Like, I made relationships with these people. They were supposed to protect me. And I literally feel like they trafficked me to Tim so Tim could traffic me around several countries and several states. And they still aren't taking responsibility for it. And I'm like, I don't want anything from you other than just to acknowledge that that's so wrong. That's so wrong. You can't do this to people. And the thing is so hurtful that they knew what he was doing. They knew he had done this in the past, and they still allowed him to work with women. They still allowed him to work with me, and they knew who I was. I was their employee. I was their friend.
They all knew that he had done it before to different women. And so that's part of what she felt was so hurtful, is that people that she trusted, including Tim, including all these, a couple other people that are involved in the federal case, like Michael Polenta, right? Matt Cooper, those people all knew. So it is interesting that O.U.R is kind of off the hook in some ways, because those people who worked for O.U.R perpetuated harmful practices.
We'll be right back. Since we're a group of journalists and writers, I think it's important to take a minute to talk about the difference between disinformation and misinformation. And Sarah, you had written about this in a previous episode. I feel like you feel pretty strongly about this. Do you have anything that you want to add?
Well, we talked a lot about how Tim Ballard's upbringing in the LDS Church likely influenced a lot of his behavior, forming O.U.R and everything thereafter. One thing we pointed out, because you brought up the difference between disinformation and misinformation, is the fact that on O.U.R's website, when Tim Ballard was still part of the organization, they have rescue numbers right there on their homepage, like the amount of children they've rescued from trafficking. But there's no evidence for that. I think that was there to just kind of fuel this image of O.U.R and therefore Tim Ballard as extremely powerful without a lot of government or systemic backing, at least as far as he wants us to think. And we analyzed how he sort of sets himself up as, or like aligns himself with Joseph Smith as a prophet, as this figurehead. And I think because of all the emotion and spirituality surrounding him and his community and everything that he does, that kind of leads people. And because, anti-trafficking is a really noble effort in general, that sort of leads people to not question the claims that he's making.
Like he treats himself as a brand, and that
Yeah.
this PR is the way that he wants to present things when it might not necessarily be 100% accurate.
Yeah. And I think you made a point in that episode, Sarah, about how even Tim Ballard's language and O.U.R under him, their language surrounding trafficking wasn't always consistent. Like sometimes they would refer to what I presume they meant traffickers, but they would say predators. And that's something different. And the muddling of the topic of trafficking in general, again, to me seems like another disinformation tactic to confuse people and kind of just get them on board and create this like good versus evil narrative or a belief cycle that made it really easy for them to, or I should say Ballard specifically, to do all of this alleged behavior.
One of the things that sticks out to me is they're always talking about child trafficking,
Yeah.
but then a lot of the women, when they go to London, places like that, they're actually grown women. And it's not to mean that trafficking is better because they're adults, right? But like they do like to conflate a lot of terms, however it sort of best fits whatever narrative they're talking about. And that is sort of just a jumbled collection of phrases and things that make you feel like they're on the moral right side.
Well, because child trafficking, that's a next level depravity, right? And I'm kind of speaking in their vernacular, like, can't we all agree child trafficking is something we should be behind? Like, it's kind of that, language. It's getting people, pulling at people and making them think that there's this like moral high ground they're on.
And I think it also caused a frenzy, to be honest, like kind of what me and Sarah talked about in episode 9 just recently about how you started noticing in airports and wherever it was telling you to watch out for signs of trafficking. And when you get these terms so misconstrued, it's actually really difficult to understand what that means, what you should be looking for, who's in danger, where danger is coming from. And I think because of that, they kind of lost the plot at some points. That doesn't seem to have really messed with donors or anything. But I think, of course, like why we're making this podcast right now is because that always comes to a head at some point. When things are not quite clicking, we have to investigate why.
I think also like obfuscating definitions and using buzzwords to do that ties back to what Andrew was saying, because I mean, it's dark to think this, but when it comes to the issue of trafficking adults, for many people, there's still a level of victim blaming. And that's one thing that concerns me with this federal lawsuit, because these women have already described such a level of victim blaming when it comes to the sexual abuse allegations. And I think that's sort of the delineation. Like, it is really easy rhetorically to get people behind the issue of child trafficking because it's children. They're innocent. But then when it's adults, there are many people who have this natural tendency to think, oh, well, how did that person get themselves into this situation? Maybe they shouldn't have been doing X, Y, and Z. And I think that mentality largely comes from fear, because people don't want to think about the fact that this could happen to them. So they want to come up with all these reasons why this other person, quote unquote, got themselves into that situation. But again, that's kind of what concerns me about the federal lawsuit, is how much of that rhetoric are we going to see? And then what's that going to do to the larger like world of anti-trafficking and much more valid, credible efforts against all forms of trafficking, especially because Tim Ballard is so high profile?
I don't think the governments of the world, for whatever they were doing or not doing, I don't think that Ballard's story changes everything, right? You still have a massive effort at the US government and even state and locals to combat child trafficking, trafficking in general. sex crimes and things like that. In some ways, it goes back to a little bit of a conversation we had last week, which is there really a need for private organizations to be doing these type of paramilitary operations? Maybe they'd be better off raising awareness and helping with aftercare. And I think that's one of the things that's really interesting is several of the women we interviewed, they all signed up because they wanted to help the kids that were rescued. They didn't really care about the operations themselves. They sort of saw that as like, oh, let the professionals do that. I really want to help with the aftercare. And that's one of the things we've heard is like, there just doesn't seem to be as much an emphasis on the aftercare as there is, or as there was under Tim Ballard with the sort of the guns and the body armor and the raids and stuff like that, the operations. And what Celeste and Kira and others, I think, signed up for is they really wanted to help those children after the fact. And maybe that's a better place for a group like O.U.R to be operating in, as opposed to being the paramilitary organization that they were under Tim Ballard, essentially.
Well, it kind of makes you wonder, is there no aftercare because there are no children that they're actually procuring on these missions? I mean,
that's certainly the accusation by Robert Gerke and Damian Moore, who's the journalist who's done a lot of research, and there's a couple other journalists who've done a lot of research. That's the accusation, is that there aren't that many kids being rescued in these operations.
Yeah, I think the woman actually said as much in some of their interviews. Where are the children? How can I help with the children?
Here's what Sasha had to say on this.
I wanted to know what was happening, if we rescued any kids. So I kept texting him, hey, what's the status of our mission? Are there any kids that have been rescued? No. So after 2 years of me asking, I just stopped asking because there was no kids. There was no updates. There was no nothing.
Which, if you watch The Sound of Freedom, that couldn't be further from... like, if you watch The Sound of Freedom, the number of children that Tim Ballard is rescuing is just endless.
Right.
Yeah, they should be up to their necks in aftercare. They should be reaching out for more volunteers to help with that. And instead, it's just crickets.
I think that also proves, going back to something Connor said earlier, that these women like Celeste who got involved with O.U.R are probably way more educated in anti-trafficking than Tim Ballard ever was, because there is research that shows trafficking victims without proper aftercare, they're at super high risk for being trafficked again. If you're running an anti-trafficking organization, private or otherwise, you have to take that into account. So if women like Celeste joined O.U.R with the intention of really focusing on aftercare, it's like they probably really knew what they were doing. And Tim Ballard kind of just, like you said, it was like optics. He just wanted this like paramilitary, what was shown in that movie is like really what he thinks was happening in his mind.
It also goes back to what we were talking about at the very beginning of this episode. I'm disappointed that the new O.U.R rescue wouldn't talk, because one of the things I'd love to know is, what are they doing in the world of aftercare, right? They're still doing operations. Now, they're not doing the Tim Ballard type operations. It's more law enforcement that they're working with. But the sense I got is that they are trying to focus on aftercare. I don't know if they actually are, but that was certainly the sense that they were trying to portray themselves. And I'd love to know more about aftercare, because as Sarah just made the point, like children, women who are trafficked once are always at risk of being trafficked if they aren't out of that cycle. Mm. And an organization like O.U.R Rescue is probably best positioned to help break that cycle, as opposed to help identifying the places and the people who are trafficking. That's really where there is a need. You have law enforcement to do the identification of the traffickers. Law enforcement is not positioned to deal with aftercare in any meaningful way.
We'll be right back. Tim Ballard might not be an actual politician, but he has brushed elbows with some that are, and he's used these political tactics to gain influence in Utah and elsewhere. So let's talk about how he capitalized on the issue of human trafficking. This is an issue that should be nonpartisan and non-polarizing, but he's using it to gain fame and power. I think one of the things that has kind of stuck out to me is that Tim Ballard really is capitalizing on actual human trafficking. He's getting people to donate. He's using the money in ways that shareholders aren't aware of. He's also using it to gain popularity, gets his movie made. He is making money off of this. And this is one of the things that bothers me the most is if you're not with him, then you're a trafficker. It's really hard to take that from him.
I still go back to the craziness of an organization that is running undercover operations, having a CEO who is on social media nonstop, who's doing interviews nonstop. And I completely understand the criticism, and I tend to agree with it, that this was a vehicle for promotion of Tim Ballard more than anything. Maybe it did some good, maybe it didn't. I like that's still, I think, very much up in the air. But what is definitive is that this O.U.R organization was a vehicle for the promotion of Tim Ballard and for whatever he wanted to promote, whether it was a political career, whether it was a movie, whether it was just himself in fundraising. That's what O.U.R was in the business of doing more than anything.
I'm kind of distilling it down to some basic tenets here, but like at the end of the day, I think Tim Ballard wanted to be an influencer, man. Like that's really what he was doing. Was he was building this persona largely on social media of this crusader and this noble higher calling. And it was all a charade. And like, you know, I will give Tim Ballard credit here. The guy believed the things, it seemed to me, he believed the things that were coming out of his mouth because he sold people on these ideas. And they always say the best way to sell somebody on the idea is for you to be the first one to buy it.
Well, how do you feel about him saying that, you know, he might be a prophet? Do you think that he really truly thinks it's a prophet? Or is this just another angle for the influencer?
Well, it's hard to say. I mean, it may be a situation where, you know, sometimes people get such an inflated view of themselves that before they know it, you know, he's talking about himself as a prophet. Like maybe he did believe that. In the beginning, I think Tim Ballard was like, I'm going to build a brand, a persona, all on the back of being this noble human trafficking crusader.
Yeah.
I really think he wanted to be president.
Yeah. I think that was one of the end goals. I can't remember what year it was, 21 or 22. There was this big conference in Utah called AlphaCon. I don't know if anybody's heard of this, but Tim was set to headline at one point. I can't remember if he actually did it, but I do know that he was attached to that sort of, you know, powerful alpha man sort of persona that he felt, I don't know, what just seems very important to him to show off. He's definitely trying to use it in a more, you know, careful way where he's saving children and saving women and whatever. But at the core of it, it's him with guns and muscles trying to show everybody how big, how powerful, how, you know, alpha
Yeah.
he is.
How insecure he is.
Some would say.
I think about this a lot just in like a digital social media age. I think he's the epitome of someone who's entirely driven by other people's perception of him and not like, I think he probably has a very weak sense of self on the inside. And then he's also got this platform within the church. He's brushed elbows with politicians, like you said, Sarah. And so these traits are just enabled for him, and it's gotten way out of hand.
I always remember a comment that both Kate Kelly and I think Abby, you made this point, which is that among young Mormon boys, and I think it's true for young boys in general, that you know, regardless of religion or ethnicity or race, anything like that, but like that there's this belief that they're the center of their own story. You know, they're Ready Player One. They are, you know, you see this with in the tech world where they think they are the sort of the guy with the remote control playing the video game, where they're the center of their story or the center of the main character of their book. That Ballard has believed that, and it's grown in the way he's believed it over years of other people telling Tim Ballard how important and special and how righteous he is.
And I think he tries to bring others into that.
Yeah.
Not just men, women as well. I mean, if you listen to the interviews we did with the women, they all signed up to be a part of this righteous world where they're doing great things and following Tim Ballard, the great leader. Collectively, they all have struggled with the fact that they were sort of duped. But I mean, I think most of the women, Kira and Celeste and others, like Sasha, they didn't say specifically that they still want to believe, but they still want to help these children, the women who are trafficked. Like they still sort of believe in the mission because they just believed in the whole effort of helping people and the cause of Tim Ballard. There's still that implanted in their mind that where they know Tim Ballard did horrible things and probably isn't on the up and up when he was running O.U.R, but they still want to sort of believe it because he was so successful in selling that narrative as him at the center of the story.
And it's such a high to feel like you're realizing your full potential and you're on the right path and you're going to help someone. Like that's such an exhilarating feeling
Yeah.
that you're going to chase that.
One of the things that I've never been able to reconcile, and perhaps this is kind of circling back to Tim Ballard and his ability to sell this noble cause, is that when you look at O.U.R under his leadership, and when you start to peel back the layers, I used this analogy before, there was no adult in the room. There was nobody that was saying, wait a second, this is not how we do these things. Like the fact that the CEO is on the ground during these operations, like usually that's more of a figurehead sort of like for optics and for, fundraising, et cetera. He's not on the ground in the nitty gritty.
The head of the FBI is not doing operations.
Right.
Mhm.
And there was no vetting. There was no real concern for experience. There was no training. Like the fact that there was no training, or in Bree Ryder's instance, the training was after she went on one of the operations. Like if there is ever a cause that should require training, it is going into these hostile environments and trying to rescue children. I've never understood how he was able to do this for so long and nobody didn't stand up and go, what are you doing?
Right.
But it also feels like he never had the right training. He never approached it as someone who knew what they were doing. He's just going to go in and bust up a small operation. Meanwhile, if you're going to do that for real, you're going to gather the intel, you're going to recognize that this person might lead you to someone else until you get to something that's big. You're not just going to throw a party because you nab someone's small time. You've cut off any kind of contact with actually finding who is trafficking to them.
Well, and let me use sort of a much lesser analogy. All of us in this conversation, to some extent, have done some investigative reporting in our careers, right? Investigative reporting does not mean calling the first name and the first phone number you find and saying, hey, what's going on with this thing? There's a process of like developing the resources, developing the contacts, making the right phone call to the right person at the right time, the right way. Like none of that occurred with him, it seems, when it came to these kinds of operations.
That reminds me, Andrew, can I get the number of your psychic?
I honestly think all of us have put more effort into finding the right information for these scripts than Tim Ballard ever did into figuring out how to bust a trafficking ring. And going back to what you were saying, Sarah, like, and just everything about how he's like just an influencer at his core. When government agencies do this, they don't have a huge party when they bust a smaller ring because there's a whole network.
Yeah, that's leverage.
Exactly. So if you make this huge announcement and publicize, this one win, you're undermining your larger efforts. And it's always blown my mind that he does get away with that kind of talk on social media. And does he even realize how he's contradicting himself?
Like imagine if the head of like an FBI unit that was investigating human trafficking had the head of the unit going on social media saying we're going to, El Salvador next week. Like this is not tour dates, man. It makes no sense.
And what do you expect to find from a massage parlor? just small change, right? Like, you're not going to find the brains of the operation there. Like, this is an outlet. This is like the smallest bit of this interconnected puzzle.
Yeah.
So that's not really much to celebrate. I want to thank you guys for joining me on this episode. Thank you to our producers Connor Powell and Abby Newhouse, and also to our writers Sarah Batchelor, Andrew Iden, and Nani Okwalogu, who couldn't join us today, but has also been a big part of this team. I really appreciate your input today. I think you've been a fantastic team. You've done tons of research, and I've been really impressed with all of your effort. Thank you so much for talking with us today. And I also want to thank our listeners for tuning in these past few weeks. We'll be back soon with a brand new single story episode later in January. And from everyone here at The Opportunist, I just want to thank you for sticking with us during this transition. So please spread the word and leave us reviews on any of the platforms you listen to your podcasts on. And until next time.